The files you are about to hear were never intended for public release. They represent fragments of wartime archives, declassified only after decades of bureaucratic struggle, whistleblower leaks, and shattered secrecy. The title stamped across these fragments is chilling in its simplicity. 5 Disturbed. 2 projects. Governments wanted completely forgotten. Buried in dusty basements of intelligence agencies, these files tell of experiments and operations that even victorious nations sought to erase. What emerges is not just a story of the defeated powers, but of the Allies themselves, revealing that desperation and ambition pushed every side into territories of horror. Each case exposes how human lives were treated as expendable data points, how nations justified the unthinkable under the veil of necessity, and how truth was buried in silence. As you listen, understand that what survived was never meant for your ears. What was destroyed will never be known, yet in the shadows of redacted lines and burned documents, the echoes remain. These are not tales of battlefield heroics, but of forbidden projects engineered in secret rooms where morality was abandoned and survival of the state was placed above the survival of the individual. What you are about to hear is history's concealed scar tissue, evidence of the lengths to which governments went, and the truths they still prefer you never uncover. Chapter 1. The Erased Nazi Mind Control Program. In the final, desperate years of the Second World War, as the Reich faced collapse on every front, secret laboratories were erected far from the battlefield. Behind their sealed doors, scientists loyal to Heinrich Himmler and the SS Ahnenerbe pursued an experiment so grotesque it was later erased from official records, codenamed Project Marionette. This undertaking sought to create the ultimate weapon of control, not a new tank or missile, but the human mind itself, stripped of its autonomy and bent into submission. The philosophy was simple and terrifying. If soldiers and civilians could be chemically broken, their will destroyed and rebuilt, they could become expendable tools of the state, living couriers, spies, or assassins who acted without hesitation. The Reich, desperate for asymmetric power, was willing to sacrifice thousands to test this theory. The earliest documents trace back to 1942, when SS medical officers working in Dachau began injecting prisoners with experimental compounds. Mixtures of mescaline, scopolamine, and high-dose amphetamines were combined in shifting ratios, administered without consent. Survivors described hallucinations so intense they lost the ability to distinguish reality from induced visions. Prisoners were ordered to recite information, and those who resisted were forced into repeated cycles of drug-induced delirium until their resistance collapsed. Guards reported some subjects would obey commands automatically, as if their memory of refusal had been erased. Others died of seizures, dehydration, or sudden cardiac arrest. No record was kept of the exact number of victims, but estimates suggest hundreds perished in the first wave of trials alone. By 1943, the program expanded to Strasbourg, where captured Soviet officers were specifically targeted. Intelligence reports note that senior SS researchers were fascinated by the possibility of programming prisoners to act as double agents. Officers were interrogated under drug-induced states, then released back into Soviet ranks to spread misinformation. Few returned. Whether these men survived or were executed by their comrades remains unknown, but the method left deep scars in those who witnessed it. Some Allied investigators later recalled finding crates of meticulously organized notes in Strasbourg, detailing responses, dosages, and behavioral breakdowns in chillingly clinical language. These files, however, never appeared in the Nuremberg evidence archives. They vanished into the hands of occupying powers, classified under different code names. When US forces liberated Dachau in April 1945, they stumbled upon laboratories filled with medical equipment and half-burned records. Reports filed by the Counterintelligence Corps describe vats of chemicals, preserved organs, and a locked safe containing notebooks filled with coded references to behavioral fracture thresholds. Yet within weeks, much of this evidence was no longer accessible. Under Operation Paperclip, American intelligence officers prioritized the seizure of scientific data that could serve Cold War interests. Rather than expose Project Marionette as a war crime, portions of its findings were repurposed. Surviving Nazi physicians were quietly recruited, given immunity in exchange for their cooperation. Their methods seeped into post-war projects that sought to weaponize psychology, culminating in the CIA's infamous M-Culture program of the 1950s. The Soviet Union, not to be outdone, launched its own parallel endeavors. Captured German data was transported east during Operation Trophy, where NKVD units studied the feasibility of psychochemical re-education. Stalin's paranoia about loyalty and espionage made the concept particularly attractive. Files discovered in Moscow years later reference human trials involving prisoners from the Gulag system, echoing the same chemical formulas once tested in Dachau. The East and West, though enemies, shared in the inheritance of this dark Nazi vision, that the human mind could be reshaped like clay, if only science was ruthless enough. What makes Project Marionette so disturbing is not merely the cruelty inflicted upon its victims, but the silence that followed. Survivors, those few who endured the experiments, were never permitted to testify at Nuremberg. Many were executed during the war's final days to prevent their stories from leaking. Families were sent generic death certificates citing natural causes or cardiac failure. Researchers who should have faced justice were instead relocated, their expertise hidden behind classified walls. The documentation that does survive often appears in fragments: a partially burned medical ledger, a redacted OSS report, a Soviet intelligence summary marked top secret, not for circulation. From these scraps, historians have pieced together a story that governments once considered too dangerous to reveal. Imagine, for a moment, a prisoner forced into a sterile room under harsh fluorescent light. Needles inserted, restraints tightened, voices instructing them to speak words they cannot resist. Their body convulses under the chemical load, their mind fractures. They emerge compliant, whispering secrets they had once vowed to die protecting. To the researchers, this was success, a step toward unlocking the mechanism of human obedience. To the victim, it was annihilation of the self. This is the true horror of Project Marionette, the erasure not only of life, but of identity. The legacy of these experiments stretches far beyond the war. In the 1970s, when US congressional hearings exposed fragments of M-Culture, faint echoes of Nazi methodology resurfaced. References to mescaline trials in Dachau, cited in CIA memoranda, confirmed that American agencies had knowingly absorbed the Reich's findings. Families of victims never received recognition, because acknowledging their suffering would mean admitting that the victors had exploited Nazi crimes for their own ends. Even today, most of the original files remain locked away in intelligence archives, stamped with classifications that ensure secrecy endures. The Reich may have fallen in 1945, but its obsession with control left a scar that shaped the covert wars of the 20th century. The pursuit of domination over the human mind, born in the laboratories of Dachau and Strasbourg, survived long after the swastika was lowered. It lived on in the shadows of Washington and Moscow, whispered about in Cold War corridors, denied by officials, and forgotten by the public. The victims remain nameless, their stories buried beneath official silence. Project Marionette was not simply erased. It was absorbed, transformed, and hidden in plain sight. Its true danger lies not in what was done, but in how easily governments justified the use of forbidden knowledge as long as it promised power. Chapter 2: The Forbidden Plague Warfare Division. Hidden under the sterile-sounding name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, Imperial Japan operated one of the most disturbing wartime divisions of the 20th century. Unit 731, stationed in Pingfang, Manchuria, became the epicenter of biological warfare research that defied every human boundary. Behind its guarded perimeter, surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by Kempeitai military police, civilians, prisoners of war, and political dissidents were stripped of humanity and turned into experimental subjects. The Japanese referred to them coldly as maruta, logs, denying their identity as men, women, and children. From 1936 until the end of the war, tens of thousands passed through this facility, few ever left alive. Inside, the experiments pushed cruelty to its scientific extreme. Victims were deliberately infected with anthrax, cholera, typhus, plague, and glanders. Entire villages in occupied China were exposed to weaponized pathogens, often disguised in food supplies or dropped from ceramic bombs designed to shatter upon impact. Some experiments were grotesquely clinical. Prisoners strapped down, vivisected without anesthesia so researchers could observe the progression of disease in real time. Frozen extremities were thawed and refrozen repeatedly until gangrene consumed the flesh, allowing doctors to study battlefield frostbite. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to high-pressure chambers until their lungs ruptured, or injected with horseblood and other substances to observe fatal reactions. To Unit 731's leaders, these deaths were not tragedies, but data points, proof of Japan's growing arsenal of biological weapons. By 1940, plague-infected fleas were cultivated in massive numbers and released in Ningbo and Changde, triggering outbreaks that killed thousands of civilians. Reports from the field describe chaos as families succumbed to high fevers, swollen lymph nodes, and rapid death, while Japanese researchers secretly recorded the effectiveness of their biological dispersal. The division sought not merely tactical advantage, but mass terror, envisioning bioweapons as a means to destabilize entire nations. Allied intelligence later discovered Japanese contingency plans to deploy plague bombs against cities as far away as San Diego and Los Angeles, should the Pacific War drag into 1946. When Japan's defeat became inevitable in 1945, the command of Unit 731 sought to erase their crimes. Buildings were dynamited, test subjects executed, and records burned in massive bonfires. Yet not everything was destroyed. Captured survivors testified to the horrors, and fragments of laboratory notebooks survived. The expectation among many was that, like the Nazis at Nuremberg, these men would face trial for crimes against humanity. Instead, an altogether darker arrangement was made. Senior officers, including General Shiro Ishii, the mastermind of Unit 731, were quietly offered immunity by the United States. The deal was struck in 1947 under classified agreements involving General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. In exchange for Ishii's research, the US absorbed the data into its own biological warfare programs. Washington justified the bargain as a strategic necessity in the face of a looming Cold War, choosing to preserve forbidden knowledge rather than prosecute its origins. Soviet forces, meanwhile, captured some Unit 731 personnel and staged their own trials in Khabarovsk in 1949. Witnesses described the atrocities in harrowing detail, recounting how civilians were lured with food before being exposed to biological agents. However, these testimonies were dismissed in the West as propaganda, despite their accuracy. The Soviet Union, too, used seized Japanese data to bolster its bioweapons programs. Thus, both superpowers, sworn enemies in public, quietly converged on the same decision: suppress the truth, protect the perpetrators, and weaponize their discoveries. The concealment was deliberate and thorough. American intelligence redacted vast portions of its reports, bearing references to Ishii and his staff under code numbers. The surviving Japanese government records downplayed Unit 731's true purpose, describing it as a water purification project. Victims' families were silenced, their villages erased from maps or left in ruins without acknowledgement. For decades, Japan itself denied the existence of Unit 731, labeling survivor testimony as fabricated. Only in the late 20th century, after persistent pressure from historians and activists, did fragments of the truth seep into public awareness. Even then, full archives remain classified, hidden in government vaults in Tokyo and Washington. The scale of the atrocities is staggering. Estimates suggest between 200,000 and 300,000 deaths resulted directly or indirectly from Unit 731's activities. These were not combatants but civilians, including children deliberately infected to measure incubation periods. The cruelty was systematic, bureaucratic, and shielded under military necessity. The unit's doctors, many of them educated at prestigious universities, justified their actions as advancing science for the empire. After the war, many returned to civilian life, taking positions as professors, researchers, and corporate scientists. They lived unpunished, their knowledge integrated into post-war Japan's economic and academic boom. Victims, however, carried lifelong scars or remained buried in unmarked graves. What makes Unit 731 particularly haunting is not just the brutality of its actions, but the way it was erased. Documents hidden under layers of classification, perpetrators reintegrated into society, and survivors denied justice created a silence that lasted generations. When Western audiences hear of wartime atrocities, they often think of Nazi concentration camps. Yet the horrors of Pingfang rivaled anything in Europe, and in some ways surpassed them in calculated cruelty. The difference was in exposure. While the world saw images of Dachau and Auschwitz, The crimes of Unit 731 were deliberately concealed by victors who found the data too valuable to discard. Consider, for a moment, a small Chinese village in 1942. Farmers wake to find strange white powders scattered on their fields, dropped overnight from aircraft. Within days, children fall ill with raging fevers, their bodies consumed by infection. Parents beg for medicine, but none is available. By the week's end, the village is silent, its population decimated. Japanese researchers, observing from afar, record notes on the spread, tally deaths, and adjust calculations for the next drop. This is not war in the traditional sense. It is the weaponization of plague, the deliberate transformation of disease into an invisible army. The dead were numbers, and the survivors were simply left to watch as their world collapsed. The tragedy of Unit 731 is compounded by its legacy. In the decades after the war, international conventions banned biological warfare, citing the lessons of WWII. Yet the knowledge gained in Pingfang never disappeared. It resurfaced in secret programs during the Cold War, shaping US and Soviet stockpiles of anthrax, plague, and smallpox. The data, collected through the suffering of innocent civilians, became part of the hidden arsenal of superpowers. It is a legacy born not only of atrocity but of complicity. Governments chose silence, and in that silence, justice was denied. Unit 731 remains a forbidden chapter precisely because its revelations are not confined to history. They expose how nations, including the victors, were willing to bury truth in exchange for advantage. The survivors' voices, faint and often ignored, remind us that beneath the redactions and denials lies a story too dangerous for governments to admit. It is a story of human beings reduced to logs, erased from memory except for the data they produced. And it is a reminder that what is hidden is often more horrifying than what is revealed. Chapter 3: Churchill's Abandoned Anthrax Island. In the summer of 1942, as German bombers hammered Britain and U-boats prowled the Atlantic, Winston Churchill's war cabinet faced a grim calculation. If the Reich unleashed chemical or biological agents against London, Britain needed the ability to respond in kind. Out of that fear was born Operation Vegetarian, a project so grotesque that its existence was long denied and its legacy remained sealed away for decades. The plan was chillingly simple. Weaponize anthrax, package it into linseed oil cattle cakes, and drop them over German farmland. The contaminated livestock would spread disease across the civilian food chain, inducing mass starvation and societal collapse. It was not a tactical weapon. It was a tool of extermination through agriculture. The testing ground chosen for this operation was Gruinard Island, a small, windswept outcrop off the coast of Scotland. Remote, uninhabited, and easily contained, it became the site of one of the most disturbing bioweapons trials in Allied history. In July 1942, under the authority of the Ministry of Supply and with direct cabinet approval, British scientists from the Portondown Research Facility began their work. Sheep were imported, tethered on the island, and exposed to bombs filled with anthrax spores. Within days, the animals succumbed to the disease, their bloated carcasses serving as grim proof of the weapon's lethality. Investigators in protective suits documented the results, noting the horrifying efficiency of spore transmission. The soil, saturated with Bacillus anthracis, became a permanent reservoir of death. What Churchill and his advisors discovered was more frightening than anticipated. Anthrax spores proved terrifyingly resilient. Unlike chemical weapons that dissipated, these spores could survive in soil for decades, even centuries. The experiment showed that if the operation were carried out against Germany, entire regions could become permanently uninhabitable. Despite these revelations, stockpiles of the anthrax-laced cattle cakes were prepared and stored, ready for deployment should Germany strike first, or if the Normandy invasion failed. Britain had, in effect, built its own weapon of mass extinction, hidden beneath the veneer of wartime necessity. The public knew nothing. Gruinard Island was quietly quarantined, its perimeter marked by forbidding signs warning against landing. Local fishermen were told to avoid its waters. Military patrols occasionally circled the area, and villagers whispered of strange experiments, but no official explanation was ever given. Classified cabinet minutes from 1943 reveal Churchill's personal endorsement of Operation Vegetarian, noting his belief that the enemy must be made to fear retaliation in kind. The Prime Minister's language, usually blunt, here carried an unmistakable tone of ruthlessness. He was prepared, if necessary, to starve millions of German civilians rather than risk defeat. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the urgency of biological weapons research diminished. Nuclear deterrence became the new focus of strategic warfare. The Anthrax project was shelved, its stockpiles quietly destroyed, and Gruinard Island was abandoned. Yet the contamination remained. For decades, scientists confirmed that the island's soil still harbored lethal spores. Even a brief landing risked infection. The site became a forbidden zone within British territory, off-limits to civilians and rarely acknowledged by officials. To those few who knew the truth, it was a silent reminder of how far Britain had been willing to go. In the early 1980s, the island returned to public attention when activists launched Operation Dark Harvest. Protesters, outraged at government secrecy, collected soil samples from Gruinard and deposited them at government research facilities, demanding decontamination. Their dramatic actions forced the state to admit what had long been denied. Gruinard was dangerously polluted with anthrax. By 1986, the Ministry of Defense initiated a multi-million-pound cleanup effort, spraying the island with formaldehyde and seawater. Only in 1990, after years of treatment and monitoring, was Gruinard officially declared safe. For nearly half a century, however, a piece of Britain had remained poisoned, haunted by the shadow of a project it wished to forget. The files that survived paint a disturbing picture of British decision-making in the darkest hours of the war. Unlike the Nazi or Japanese experiments, Operation Vegetarian was not conducted by fringe ideologues or rogue divisions. It was sanctioned at the highest levels of government, involving respected scientists, military planners, and the Prime Minister himself. It demonstrates that even democratic states, when pressed to the edge of survival, were willing to contemplate measures that blurred the line between warfare and genocide. The British government's silence for decades was not merely about protecting wartime secrets. It was about shielding its reputation from the moral weight of those choices. Imagine standing on Gruinard Island in 1942. The air is heavy with the salty tang of the sea, the wind cutting across the barren ground. Sheep bleat uneasily, tethered in neat rows. A team of men in protective suits sets a device on the soil, then retreats as a canister erupts, releasing a fine mist invisible to the naked eye. Hours later, nothing seems different, yet the clock has started. Within days, the animals collapse one by one, their bodies distended and lifeless. The scientists record their observations, detached and methodical, while the island itself transforms into a silent graveyard. That desolate patch of Scottish rock became a testing ground for extinction. The moral implications reverberated long after the war. Britain officially signed the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, pledging never to develop or store such weapons again. Yet the legacy of Gruinard remained a scar, proof that the line between defense and atrocity could vanish under the pressure of war. Scholars who later examined declassified cabinet records noted the ease with which discussions about poisoning farmland were normalized, as though millions of civilian deaths were simply numbers on a strategic balance sheet. That normalization, the quiet acceptance of the unthinkable, was perhaps the most chilling revelation of all. Churchill's Anthrax Island is remembered today as a footnote, a curiosity for historians and locals. But in truth, it represents one of the most dangerous paths not taken. Had the war turned differently, had D-Day faltered, or Germany struck Britain with chemical weapons, the plan might have been enacted. Millions of German civilians could have starved as their countryside turned toxic. The post-war landscape of Europe might have been permanently altered, its fields poisoned, and its population decimated. What Gruinard proved is that victory often came at the edge of catastrophe, and that governments prepared for measures they later hoped would never see light. In that tension, between survival and morality, lies the disturbing legacy of Britain's abandoned Anthrax Island. Chapter 4: Stalin's Hidden Penal Tank Divisions. The Soviet Union's war against Nazi Germany is remembered for its staggering sacrifices: 27 million lives lost, cities reduced to rubble, and vast armies thrown into battles of annihilation. Yet, hidden within this colossal struggle lies one of the most suppressed and disturbing stories of the Red Army: the penal tank divisions. Officially, the existence of penal battalions, or Strafbati, was acknowledged. These were units composed of disgraced officers, deserters, political prisoners and criminals, thrown into suicidal missions to redeem themselves with blood. What remains buried, however, is the extension of this concept into armored warfare. Makeshift tank units crewed not by trained veterans, but by men considered expendable by Stalin's war machine. The origins of these penal formations can be traced to Stalin's Directive No. 227, issued on July 28, 1942. The decree, famous for the phrase, "not one step back," was born from desperation as German armies pushed deep into Soviet territory. The directive forbade retreat, established blocking detachments to shoot deserters, and authorized the creation of penal units to enforce discipline through terror. Men sentenced for cowardice, political unreliability, or minor infractions were stripped of rank and forced into these units. While infantry penal battalions are known, buried archives from the NKVD reveal darker experiments, penal tank crews tasked with impossible missions. By 1943, as the Red Army began to rebuild its armored forces, shortages of trained tankers forced commanders into grim improvisation. Convicts from the Gulag system, men convicted of theft, dissent, or sabotage, were placed into decrepit T-34s and KV-1s salvaged from battlefields. Many of these vehicles were damaged, poorly repaired, or missing essential equipment. Ammunition was often limited, and fuel supplies uncertain. Penal tank crews were ordered to spearhead attacks, driving straight into fortified German lines. Their role was not to win battles, but to draw fire, expose enemy positions, and clear mines with their lives. Survivors of regular Red Army tank brigades later recalled watching penal tanks roll forward like doomed convoys, exploding under artillery barrages, while NKVD detachments stood behind to ensure no one attempted to flee. Casualty rates in these units were catastrophic. Reports suggest losses of over 80% in single engagements. Few men lasted longer than weeks. Those who survived were sometimes granted pardon, but more often recycled into fresh suicide missions. Commanders referred to them as metal coffins crewed by the guilty, a phrase that never appeared in official histories. The Soviet state, obsessed with presenting its struggle as heroic and unified, erased all mention of penal armored units from post-war accounts. Even the existence of penal infantry battalions was sanitized, depicted as honorable formations where redemption was earned through sacrifice. In reality, they were slaughterhouses by design. NKVD reports, now declassified, describe chilling details. In the summer of 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, penal tank companies were deployed in preliminary assaults against German Panther divisions. Crews, often untrained in gunnery, were ordered to advance at full speed into anti-tank defenses. One report notes that an entire penal tank regiment of 40 vehicles was annihilated within 30 minutes, leaving smoldering wrecks scattered across the steppe. Survivors attempting to abandon their burning tanks were shot by NKVD blocking detachments. The brutality was not concealed from the men. It was the very point of their assignment. They were to die facing the enemy, or die by the hand of their own state. For Stalin, the logic was simple. Fear and expendability were tools of war. In his worldview, every citizen was a resource to be consumed for victory. Penal tank units served not only as cannon fodder, but as a lesson to the regular Red Army. Retreat or cowardice would be punished by death in steel coffins. This dual purpose, military and psychological, made the units effective in enforcing discipline, even as they wasted countless lives. The Soviet propaganda machine, meanwhile, broadcast stories of tank heroes like Dmitry Lavrinenko and Alexander Oskin, never mentioning that hundreds of nameless penal crews died anonymously, erased from official memory. After the war, survivors of these units faced a second erasure. Those who lived often found themselves re-imprisoned in the Gulag, accused of treason or desertion despite their service. To speak of penal tanks was dangerous. It contradicted the heroic myth of the Great Patriotic War. Official Soviet military histories made no reference to such formations. Even in memoirs, veterans who hinted at their existence used coded language or vague references to suicide units. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that fragments of documentation emerged from NKVD and Red Army archives, confirming what survivors had whispered for decades. Imagine the scene: a winter morning on the Eastern Front, snow covering the wreckage of past battles. A line of battered T-34s groans to life, their engines coughing in the cold. Inside, the crews, men with shaved heads, prison tattoos, and hollow eyes, brace themselves. Their commanders shout orders, promising redemption if they succeed. They know the truth: there will be no survival. As the tanks lurch forward, German anti-tank guns open fire, shells ripping through armor. One by one, the vehicles erupt in flames, their crews trapped inside. Smoke rises over the steppe, a funeral pyre for the condemned. Behind them, NKVD soldiers watch with rifles ready, ensuring no one turns back. This was the reality of Stalin's hidden penal tank divisions. AEA, battlefield sacrifice erased from history. Books. The moral weight of these formations lies not only in the cruelty of their use, but in their suppression. The Soviet Union, determined to present itself as a unified force of heroism and resilience, could not admit that it had driven its own citizens to die in tanks designed for slaughter. By burying the truth, the state protected its myth at the expense of its victims. Even today, Russian military historians tread carefully, acknowledging penal infantry, but rarely confronting the existence of armored suicide squads. Families of the men who perished often never knew the circumstances of their deaths, receiving only vague notifications that their sons had fallen in battle. Stalin's penal tank divisions embody the darkest truth of total war: that human beings can be reduced to disposable components, sacrificed not for strategy but for terror and control. Their story, long hidden, forces us to reconsider the cost of Soviet victory and the cruelty of a system that erased its own atrocities. Beneath the triumph of Berlin and the banners of victory, countless men died anonymous, their names and deeds obliterated by the very state they served. The tanks they drove were not instruments of redemption, but steel tombs, rolling evidence of a hidden chapter Stalin demanded the world forget. Chapter 5: The Classified Human Radiation Trials. In the shadow of the atomic age, when victory over Japan was still celebrated and mushroom clouds loomed as symbols of power, a new chapter of experimentation began, one that was buried even deeper than the wartime projects it followed. Between 1944 and 1947, under the Manhattan Engineer District and later the Atomic Energy Commission, a series of human radiation trials were conducted in total secrecy. These were not experiments on soldiers in battlefield conditions, nor volunteers who understood the risks. They were carried out on unsuspecting civilians, patients in hospitals, men and women in state institutions, even children whose parents were never informed. The stated purpose was scientific: to understand how plutonium, uranium, and other radioactive isotopes traveled through the body, how much could be absorbed before tissue began to fail, and how fallout might affect human populations. The reality was far darker. The subjects were treated as test material, their lives quietly sacrificed in the name of national security. One of the most disturbing programs involved direct injections of plutonium into hospital patients. In 1945, at the University of California Hospital in San Francisco, doctors working under the supervision of the Manhattan Project selected unsuspecting patients, often poor, ill or dying, without informed consent. A man known in documents only as Cal 1 became the first American to be injected with plutonium. He believed he was receiving routine medical care. Instead, a radioactive isotope that would remain in his bones for the rest of his life was introduced into his bloodstream. Dozens more followed across hospitals in Chicago, Rochester, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Records show that at least 18 people were subjected to these secret injections. Most were never told, and their families remained in ignorance until decades later, when declassified files revealed the truth. The secrecy extended beyond injections. A program known as Project Sunshine involved the collection of human tissue samples from around the world, including bones from deceased infants and children. Without consent from families, remains were harvested and analyzed for radioactive isotopes, primarily strontium-90, to measure fallout exposure. Another initiative, codenamed Program F, conducted by the University of Rochester, secretly tested fluoride's effects on the human body, not for dental health, but as a byproduct of uranium processing. Every study was cloaked in layers of classification, sanitized in reports, and hidden behind technical jargon that masked its human cost. What made these experiments particularly disturbing was the deliberate deception. Patients signed hospital admission forms, but were never informed they were part of atomic testing. Families were assured that their loved ones received the best care available, while in reality, they were used to track radioactive decay. Internal memos reveal that doctors and administrators were aware of the ethical violations. A 1947 Atomic Energy Commission document bluntly stated, "It is desirable to conduct experiments on humans without their knowledge. These words, stark in their callousness, encapsulate the mentality of an era in which scientific advancement was pursued at any cost. The trials extended into vulnerable communities. Reports confirm that mentally disabled children in institutions were fed radioactive oatmeal at the Penal State School in Massachusetts, disguised as part of a nutrition study sponsored by MIT and the Atomic Energy Commission. Orphans, soldiers, and even prisoners were also subjected to radiation exposures without consent, often under the guise of routine medical research. These groups were chosen precisely because they had no power, no advocates, and no ability to refuse. Their suffering was hidden behind classification stamps and redacted lines. When fragments of this truth surfaced decades later, the scale of the cover-up became clear. During the 1970s, investigative journalists uncovered hints of the plutonium injections, but it was not until the 1990s that the US government formally acknowledged them. Declassified files revealed the extent of the deception, sparking outrage among families who discovered their relatives had been experimented on like lab animals. Congressional hearings exposed how data from these trials had shaped Cold War policies on nuclear safety and fallout exposure. The results were not discarded. They were integrated into the very foundations of America's nuclear program, influencing decisions on weapons testing, reactor design, and permissible radiation doses for workers and civilians. The moral consequences are staggering. Victims were never compensated during their lifetimes. Many died believing they had simply succumbed to natural illness, unaware that their suffering was deliberately inflicted. Their children and grandchildren carried not only grief, but in some cases, genetic effects from exposure. The doctors and administrators involved rarely faced punishment. Instead, many continued respected careers in academia, medicine, or government service, their past obscured by national security classification. The institutions that conducted the trials, universities, hospitals, laboratories, profited from federal funding, while their victims were forgotten. Imagine a hospital ward in 1945. The air smells of antiseptic, nurses move briskly between beds, and patients trust the physicians in white coats. A man lies waiting, weak but hopeful, unaware that the injection about to enter his arm carries not medicine, but plutonium. He looks at the doctor with gratitude, never realizing he has been transformed into a data point in a secret file. The needle pierces, the liquid flows, and his fate is sealed. Decades later, his bones will still emit radiation, long after his name has been erased from records. This is not science fiction. This was sanctioned policy, carried out in the name of progress, and deliberately hidden from the very people it exploited. The classified human radiation trials remind us that atrocity is not confined to battlefields or enemy regimes. It can emerge in the sterile hallways of hospitals, in the offices of government agencies, in laboratories where men in suits discuss acceptable risk. These experiments reveal a disturbing continuity with the very wartime crimes the Allies condemned at Nuremberg. While Nazi doctors were prosecuted for human experimentation, Allied scientists quietly adopted similar methods under a different flag, justified by national security. The silence surrounding these trials was not accidental. It was engineered, a deliberate burial of evidence that might tarnish the image of the victors. The revelations still haunt public trust in science and government. They raise questions that remain unanswered. How much was truly recorded? How many files remain sealed? How many names are missing from the lists of victims? The classified human radiation trials are not simply a historical footnote. They are a warning. They show how fear, secrecy, and ambition can combine to strip away humanity, reducing people to test subjects in a game of survival. In the glow of the atomic age, the world entered a new era of power, and a new era of hidden suffering, written not in open archives, but in classified files stamped, never to be released. The archives close, but the questions remain. Disturbed what? Projects governments wanted completely forgotten was not a journey into myths or exaggerated tales. It was an excavation of scars deliberately buried under layers of secrecy. From Nazi laboratories that twisted the human mind, to Japanese plague units concealed behind diplomatic silence, from Britain's abandoned island of Anthrax to Stalin's disposable divisions, and finally to the Allies' own radiation trials, each file reveals a truth governments sought to erase. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. but systemic operations justified by the language of war, survival, and progress. Yet the legacy endures. Contaminated islands, broken families, and a lingering distrust of the very institutions meant to protect us. As you step away from these revelations, consider how much of history remains locked away. How many more files sit sealed in vaults marked top secret? What would they tell us about the bargains struck, the lives sacrificed, and the truths concealed? Perhaps the real question is not what was uncovered, but what remains hidden still, waiting, silent, until the day the archives are opened again.